Today's lesson will be Chapter 23, Problem 1B. I'm going to share with you my Excel spreadsheet that I've made for this particular problem. What I've done is I've copied from Cengage the given information for this problem, but I wanted to use Excel this time because there's a lot of calculations in this problem, and so I just wanted to use Excel. So with Chapter 23, Problem 1B, what we're going to be looking at is direct materials and direct labor variance analysis. You remember in the last chapter, we worked on budgets. This chapter goes hand in hand with budgets. It's really what management would do after a period of time has passed. You would compare your actual results with your budgeted amounts. And so when we do variance analysis, we're trying to determine what actually happened versus what our budget said that was going to happen. And if there were any variances or differences, we'd be able to go back and analyze those differences. Now, in this chapter, there are going to be direct materials variance analysis that you're going to have to know how to do, as well as direct labor variance analysis and factory overhead variance analysis. So today we're going to talk about direct materials and direct labor, and at another time we'll talk about factory overhead analysis. We're going to be the Lenny Clothing Manufacturing Company, and this company has 25 employees, and each employee provides 40 hours of productive labor per week. Information about a production week is as follows. So they've given us all this information about standard wage per hour. Now, what I want to talk to you about is what standard wage per hour means. This is your budgeted amount. Anytime you see standard, it's what it should have been. So they've given you the standard wage per hour at $12. They've given you also the standard labor time per unit. This is the time it takes to manufacture one unit, and it was the budgeted amount is what they thought was going to happen. And it's 12 minutes. And so a little bit later on, we're going to show you how to convert this 12 minutes to parts of an hour in this video. So the next thing that they've given you is the standard number of yards of fabric per unit. Again, anytime it says standard, it means that was the budgeted amount. And in this case, it's 5 yards. The standard price per yard of fabric was $5. The actual price of the fabric was $5.10. So notice our wording has changed to actual. What we're going to be doing is comparing our actual with our standard amounts to see if there was any variance. And if there was, we would need to investigate that as management to see why these things have happened. Actual yards of fabric that was used during the week was 26,200 yards. The number of units that were produced during the week, this is the actual number of units that were produced, which is 5,220. Actual wage per hour is $11.80, and actual hours for the week are 1,000. In requirement number 1, they're wanting us to determine the standard, the budgeted cost per unit for direct materials and direct labor. And they want you to round the cost per unit to 2 decimal places. So I'm going to start by finding the standard cost per unit for direct materials. And the way you do that is you use a formula. The standard number of yards of fabric per unit times the standard price per yard of fabric will give you the direct materials. I've abbreviated that in some of the information in this problem. DM stands for direct materials standard cost per unit. This is the formula for that. So the only thing you have to do is you have to pick out from the information above what your standard number of yards of fabric are per unit. The budgeted number of yards of fabric per unit was 5 yards. Once you know what your standard number of yards of fabric are per unit, you would multiply this by the standard price, that's the budgeted amount that you expected, to get the amount of the budgeted cost per unit for your direct materials. The standard price per yard of fabric was given to you right here, and that's $5. So we're simply going to multiply 5 yards times $5 to get the direct materials standard cost per unit of $25. So use this formula when you're finding the standard cost per unit for your direct materials. They also have asked you to calculate the standard cost per unit for direct labor. And to do that, you also use a formula. You're going to take your standard labor time per unit, what it takes you to, what you have budgeted, the time that it's going to take you to manufacture 1 unit. And then you're going to multiply that by the standard wage per hour. And the standard labor time per unit, you'll remember, was 12 minutes. So what we want to do is we want to change this to an amount of hours. And so to do that, excuse me, I've jumped around here for some reason or another. Let me put it on the right thing there. So as you can see, I've got a formula up here, and I want to talk to you about that. The standard labor time per unit was 12 minutes. But what we need to do is we need to convert this to an hourly amount. So you see here where I've divided it by 60, that's 60 minutes. So 12 minutes divided by 60 minutes is the part of an hour that it takes to produce 1 unit. And then we're going to multiply that by the amount of the wage per hour. That was our standard wage per hour of $12. So 12 minutes divided by 60 minutes times $12 will give you $2.40, which is your standard cost per unit. And then what they ask you to do in Cengage was to determine the total standard cost per unit, and that would be your materials plus your labor. So we're going to add $25 and $2.40 to get $27.40. This is your standard cost per unit. Now in part B, they want you to determine what we call a price variance. They also want you to determine a quantity variance, and they also want you to determine the total direct materials cost variance. And if there is an favorable variance, which we're going to talk about in just a minute, you need to enter it as a negative number using a minus sign, and an unfavorable variance as a positive number. All right, so anyway, to determine the price variance, there's a formula for that. You're going to take your actual price per yard, and you're going to subtract out your standard price per yard. And I've abbreviated this out to the side because when I'm normally in a classroom, I like to use abbreviations, so I have to write all this out here. So it's kind of like a habit for me. So AP stands for actual price. SP stands for standard price. Standard price is our budgeted amount. Actual price is what actually happened. You're going to find the difference between those two. And so what I did is I just plugged in my actual price per yard, $5.10, which is B11 right here. The actual price per yard was given at $5.10. This is your actual price per yard. You're going to compare it with your budgeted price per yard, which is your standard price per yard. Your standard price per yard was $5. And so as you can see, the difference between these is 10 cents. And what that means is since your actual price was more than what you had budgeted, you're going to have an unfavorable variance. So this 10 cent here is unfavorable. The difference is unfavorable in this case because actual price was more than the standard price. Once you know the difference, which we call the variance, you're going to multiply this by the actual quantity of the fabric used. Now this is actual quantity here. Notice I put AQ beside of this because sometimes, like I said in class, I refer to this as AQ. So the difference times the actual quantity of fabric used equals the price variance for my direct materials. So because my actual price was more than my standard price, my budgeted amount, 10 cent is unfavorable. I have to multiply this by the actual quantity of fabric used, and that's given. The actual quantity of fabric used is 26,200 yards. So that's where I'm getting this amount right here. I'm just plugging it in. And then you simply multiply 10% times 26,200, and that will give you a $2,620 unfavorable variance. And so since our actual price was more than our standard price, it made the variance unfavorable. We would want to investigate as management why this actual price was more than what we had budgeted for. You will probably go back to your purchasing department and ask them questions about why the actual price was more than what the company had budgeted for. It may have been something simple, like there was simply a price increase by the supplier, or it may have been something else that caused this particular variance. But as management, you would want to investigate this variance. And I put a notation down here in bold for you because I really wanted to drive home the fact that the direct materials price variance is unfavorable because the actual price was more than the standard price. The second type of variance that they wanted you to calculate in Part B is the direct materials quantity variance. So we're going to look at the actual quantity of fabric that we used. You're going to pull that right off of the information that was given. The actual quantity of fabric that was used during the week is 26,200 yards. So this amount is 26,200 yards. You're going to subtract the actual quantity, you're going to subtract from the actual quantity the standard quantity of fabric. And what you'll have to do in this case is you'll have to determine that by using this formula. A lot of times they'll give you all the information except for the standard quantity of items. So this is how we calculate the standard quantity of items. We're going to take the standard number of yards that we need to produce 1 unit, and we're going to multiply that by the actual units that we produced. So that will give us the standard quantity that we had during the period of time that was being measured. That is 26,100. And again, I've got a formula up here if you've forgotten it, but it's 5 is the standard number of yards per fabric per unit that is given in the information, and then you multiply it by the actual units produced, which was given. These two multiplied by each other gives you the quantity, the standard quantity of fabric, which you're going to compare to your actual quantity. And again, the actual amount of fabric that we used is more than what we had budgeted for. The difference is what we call the variance, is $100. And this variance is unfavorable because our actual was more than what we had budgeted for. You're going to take this variance and you're going to multiply it by the standard price. And the standard price is in the given information, but you can also find it right here. So you don't have too far to look. You don't have to scroll up and down because it's right there too. But 100 times $5 is $500 as our unfavorable variance. And just like we did before, we want to investigate this unfavorable variance. We would want to know why it took us more fabric than what we had budgeted for. So it may be simply that you need to go to the production department and ask them some questions about why it took more fabric. It may be that you had been received in some fabric that was defective, and so you had to cut around it to be able to produce whatever it is that we're producing for this company. I think it's a pair of jeans or something like that. But you would want to go back and investigate why the actual quantity of fabric was more than your standard quantity. It may have been something simple, like you may have hired some new employees and they're just learning how to cut the fabric and they cut some of it wrong. And so, but anyway, you want to investigate it to see why that happened, and you would want to take action if it was necessary. So these are things that can help you with performance evaluation. Now, I wouldn't just use the unfavorable variances to evaluate employee performance, but it's something that can give you an idea of what's going on with the operations of your business and can help you to correct these amounts in the future. Now, another thing that they wanted you to do is they wanted you to total the cost variances. So that's simply adding the two of these together. So I just restated it for you. There was a $2,620 unfavorable variance. There was a $500 unfavorable variance for your quantity variance. Because both of these were unfavorable, the total direct materials cost variance would be unfavorable. In part C, we're going to determine the rate variance. The rate variance has to do with the labor. These are labor variances that we're going to be doing in part C. So labor variances are broken down into direct labor rate variances, and they're also based on time variances. And so in order to figure out what a rate variance is, we would need to know what our actual rate is. And again, that's given information that was given in cell address B14. So if you go up here, that's your actual wage per hour. You're going to compare that to your standard rate, which was also given in the information above. Your standard labor wage rate per hour was $12. And so your actual labor rate was less than what you had budgeted for. Notice the difference between these is 20 cents. This variance is a favorable variance. And the favorable variance would be multiplied by the actual direct labor hours to get the direct labor rate variance. The actual direct labor hours were given to you at 1,000 hours. So if you multiply 20 cents times 1,000 actual direct labor hours, it will give you a $200 favorable variance. Notice favorable variances have negatives in front of them, and that's because the actual rate was less than the standard rate, so that makes this negative. So when you put it in Cengage, make sure you put a minus sign in front of the favorable variance, because if you don't, it will mark it wrong. And so you'll be thinking that, oh, I know this amount is right. It has to be the amount is right. And it'll be something simple like you don't put a minus sign in front of it. So make sure in Cengage, if you come up with a favorable variance, make sure you enter it as a negative amount. The next calculation is your time variance. You're going to take your actual hours, which was 1,000, and that was given to you. Your actual hours for the week was 1,000 hours. You're going to compare it to your standard hours. This amount was not given. You have to use this formula to figure out what the standard hours are. The standard hours are calculated by taking the standard number of hours it takes to produce one unit. And then we're going to multiply that by the actual units produced. So notice my formula here. Remember, they gave us that the standard amount of time that it takes to produce one unit is 12 minutes. And we have to convert that to an hourly amount. So to do that, 12 minutes divided by 60 minutes will give you the standard number of hours it takes to produce one unit. And then we will multiply that by the actual units produced, which was a given amount. And that tells us the standard hours that we have for this time variance. So the next part is to find the variance amount. You're going to compare the actual hours to what you had budgeted for. Again, because our actual hours was less than our standard hours, this is a negative amount or a favorable amount. We will multiply this favorable amount times the standard direct labor rate, which was $12. You can get that at the top of the page, but you've also got it calculated right here already. So you just enter it in from here. So 44 hours times $12 per hour gives you a $528 favorable variance. And that's your time variance. And so you would want to investigate why this time variance was favorable. You would want to go back to your production department to see why they told you that it would take them this amount of hours for production when the actual hours were less. And so you'd want to investigate this favorable variance. It may be that you have hired employees that had a lot of experience to do the job, and because of that, it took you less hours than what it normally would have. But anyway, you want to investigate it. The last thing they want you to calculate on this problem is the total direct labor cost variance, which is simply adding both of these together. So you had a negative 200 favorable rate variance. You have a negative $528 time variance. Because both of these are favorable, the total negative amount is $728 that is favorable. So what you need to get out of this problem is you need to learn the formulas for calculating the direct materials variances. Direct materials has two variances. They have a price variance and they have a quantity variance. Learn these formulas. If you don't do anything else in this chapter, do that. Your labor variances are broken down into two separate variances: direct labor rate variance and the time variance. Learn the formulas for these. That's what it takes to master this particular chapter. So that's all I'm going to talk to you about today. So I'm going to stop sharing this with you, and we'll see you again next time. Bye-bye.